Biology can be divided into microbiology if you're studying really tiny things, cell biology if you're looking at the structures within a eukaryotic cell, ecology if you're looking at ecosystems, and so on and so forth. For our purposes, we're going to begin by talking about the levels of organization, a smaller scaling as it relates to human health. So on your outlines, I ask you to recognize the 5 primary levels of organization within a living structure. Atoms become the cells itself. These cells can come together to form tissues. Multiple tissues that have a similar function become organs. Multiple organs that perform complementary functions become part of an organ system. And when you've got multiple organ systems that fill in each other's gaps, you get a live organism. And this is really the foundation of our entire term, because multicellular organisms like you or I don't just have many cells, but they have many types of cells. And so we have to understand these levels of organization when we look at the microscopic scale. So cells, microorganisms, filaments, organelles. One thing becomes really clear and apparent. Form dictates function. All the cells in your body have the same exact genetic code. They're all carbon copies of what it means to be you, and that's encoded in the DNA. And yet, those same instructions, depending upon what is turned on, what genes are expressed, can give rise to a neuron or a muscle cell or an immune cell. And this is a process called differentiation, which we'll talk about later in the term. The idea here is that when you turn on certain genes and when you enable certain skills, this changes the form of the cell. And that form, what it looks like, tells us a lot about what it can do. So what does it mean to be alive? And what's something that the smallest protist or algae and the complex banana and human have in common? They have to at least be made up of one cell. And that's because you cannot get smaller than a cell and be able to do all the subsequent criteria. The second criteria is that you have to eat and excrete. You have to obtain materials and energy from the outside world and process them. Number 3, you have to respond to the environment. You have to be able to take signals and situational cues and modify your responses to ensure your survival in the outside world. Number 4 is similar to this, but this time it's responding to internal cues and maintaining an internal environment. We summarize this by calling it homeostasis. Number 5, you have to grow and develop. Even the smallest single-celled organisms exhibit some maturation and we can age them. And then number 6 is reproduction. You have to have the ability to reproduce cells, and so that continuity is essential for life. In the sciences, a theory is not just some idea. This is the result of hundreds of thousands of studies and predictive modeling, and we can say with 99.9% of certainty, everything that we've looked at the past supports this. And so cell theory basically can be summarized as saying that the cell is the basic unit of life, because you cannot get smaller than the cell to complete and check off all the other criteria of a living thing. The cell itself is a self-contained system that can keep biological functions inside, therefore maintain homeostasis, can keep the environment outside, but respond to it and thereby respond to the external environment. It is permeable, let nutrients in and waste out, which allows it to eat and excrete. The cell does get physically a little bit larger prior to cell replication, and therefore we see that growth and development as well as reproduction. So we begin with anatomical position. Understand that anatomical position is a standard body map. It's a standard way to represent the body, to look at the body, that allows us to have very specialized vocabulary to consistently describe areas of the body relative to one another, not necessarily to what the body shape is at any point in time. So an example of this, the anatomical position as defined is standing, feet shoulder width apart, palms to the side of the hips, facing forward. And when we do this, we can say things like the head is superior to the navel, meaning the head is above the navel. And so it wouldn't matter if the person is standing before us like this anterior and posterior view of a woman, or if she's a trapeze artist hanging upside down. When we consider anatomical position, we're always in our minds orienting the body. This allows us to say anterior, posterior, medial, a lateral and consistently mean the same thing. And so those terms are consistent based upon the body's anatomical position. Remember that anatomical position is standing upright, facing the observer, eyes forward, feet flat, arms at the side, palms up. Now take a moment to recognize the terminology as it relates to anatomical position. Superior is above, inferior below, anterior in the front, posterior towards the back. Medial and lateral are referring to how central it is. So your navel, your belly button is medial to the body, but your fingers are going to be lateral. They're very towards the outside of the body. If you say something intermediate, that's somewhere in between. We can also use proximal or distal, and that's closest or farthest, respectively, to the trunk, to the central line. And then when we're talking about superficial and deep, we're now doing an access penetrating the body. The intestines would be deep, but the skin would be superficial. When we consider anatomical position, we also consider how the body can be divided up. And so it's important to recognize sagittal, frontal, and transverse planes. These create two-dimensional sections of our three-dimensional body. So sagittal is left versus right, frontal, front and back, okay, or anterior and posterior. And then the transverse divides right at the navel, and it's going to go into your superior and inferior planes. As we penetrate further into the bodies, we can look at body cavities. These are hollow compartments that contain organs and cells that have a shared functionality. And this is really just a mechanism so that our body can maintain internal organization. And more importantly, body cavities are not stagnant. Many of them can change size. One cavity to identify on your handouts is the cranial cavity. This includes simply the brain. The next cavity is the entire spinal column. Now, it's important to point out that the spinal cavity is the hollow cavity in which the vertebra and the spinal cord exist. Third cavity is the thoracic cavity. Okay, this includes our lungs, thymus, heart, esophagus, trachea, and this is one, put a star next to it, is one of those cavities that can exhibit size changes. And we know this, right? If you place your hand on your chest and take a deep breath, you can feel it expand and lift up. And if you expend all your breath, you can feel it sink down. Fourth is your abdominal cavity. This too, put a star next to it, can exhibit size changes. If you eat a particularly large meal because it's Thanksgiving or a birthday or an awesome buffet, your stomach will distend. Now, because the abdominal cavity is so large, it has been further divided up into quadrants and regions. I don't ask you to memorize the different regions or quadrants, but to recognize instead the significance of them. And the idea here is it allows you to narrow in on particular regions that might be subject to some sort of dysfunction, disease, anomaly, or incident. Number 5 is the pelvic cavity. This too gets a star because it changes size as you eat and process your body waste, urine, and fecal matter. This region will get larger. Or if you're pregnant and we've got reproductive organs here, it will swell as the baby grows, and so we'll see some changes there as well. 6th cavity, and these are smaller ones, so we'll move quicker, is the oral. 7th is nasal. 8th is the orbital. This is where your eyes are. And then the 9th, this one often gets overlooked, is the middle ear. Now we continue to look at the next level. Within these cavities, there are multiple tissues. And so we're going to go over and cover the 4 tissue types and its function. Okay. And so just as a summary here, we cover the epithelial is for covering. You'll find this everywhere that there is an internal cover or the external cover. The epithelial tissue is always facing the innermost areas of your body or the exteriormost areas of the body because they're always interfacing with the outside world. And so your throat, your esophagus, those all contain, your lungs all contain epithelial tissue because they're interfacing with the air from the outside world. Your skin also contains epithelial tissue because it's interfacing with the outside world. Connective tissue is for support. It connects the body. Muscle, we know this intuitively, is used for movement. Nervous tissue is used for control and communication. So epithelial tissue, some common features that I want you to be able to identify is that they're always adjoined to create continuous sheet. They exhibit polarity, meaning that there is a clear top surface and bottom surface. We call these the apical and the basal surface. There's almost no blood flow in your epithelial tissue. As far as functions go, these are largely protective. If you're interfacing with the outside world, and if you're easily replaced by new cells, that makes you very expendable, because the world can be dangerous. It can be salty and hot and cold and acidic. Just some terms to recognize with respect to epithelial tissue. We often describe them as simple or stratified. Simple means that it's only one layer thick. Stratified means multi-layered. And then the shapes, which are the terms squamous, cuboidal, or columnar, and that has to do with whether they're very square, wider versus tall, or taller versus wide. As far as connective tissue goes, some common features to recognize are that the connective tissue is never intended to interface with the environment. It's also highly vascularized, which means that there's lots of blood flow, and it usually involves free-floating cells in a matrix, so in some sort of liquid soup. Some good examples of connective tissue are going to be blood, immune cells, your lymphocytes. This ties in with their functionality. They're supportive, and they interconnect distant parts of the body and tissues. And that brings us to tissue type number 3, muscles. 3 things about muscles. They are highly vascularized, lots of blood flow here. The second thing is it's excitable. It responds to stimulus. And the third thing is that the 2 most prominent fibers are actin and myosin, which are there for contraction, so we can pull and result in movement. And therein lies its primary function. And the last tissue we want to cover is nervous tissue. Common features here: highly excitable, and the bulk of it is in your brain and spinal cord. The function here is spread the information, convey important bits to the brain so the brain can make ultimate decisions on how you should respond. So we're going to talk about some of the common types of imaging. The goal here is to integrate the anatomy and physiology, to recognize the structures and what they do or are failing to do, so we can make more informed diagnoses and better treatment plans. Now, one thing I want to point out is that there's a difference between anatomical and physiological visualizations. Not all tools are created the same. An MRI will show you that you have a brain, because that's an anatomical visualization. Whether you're alive or dead, the same image would result. But a PET scan is done in real time, and it shows brain activity. So the PET scan focuses on functional information such as physiological data, and that would only be useful and relevant if the patient was alive as opposed to a cadaver. So the first one, X-rays. How it works: we're actually sending ionizing radiation, which is absorbed or reflected based upon the density of the body structures within. It's really good in pathology of skeletal systems. A CT scan is very similar to an X-ray. The only difference here is it does it through cross-sectional images, which allows us to create 3-dimensional images. And the next step is the PET scan. That stands for positron emission tomography. What it's doing is it's using gamma rays instead of X-rays. PET scan is really good for live physiological responses. We're looking at metabolic processes that are active in the body right then and there. The PET scan allows us to get 3-dimensional images. An MRI, magnetic resonance imaging, it's using magnets, magnetic fields, and radio waves. There's no radiation whatsoever. It will provide a very similar insight to the CT scan, but when to use it will differ, because you cannot use the MRI if your patient has any metal inside their body. On the whole, because MRI does not use any ionizing radiation, it's generally favored as opposed to CT scans. But one thing to recognize here is it can be more expensive, time-consuming, and the machinery used is a little bit claustrophobic. The last one is an ultrasound. How it works is it sends sound waves towards the body, and based upon how they're reflected back from the soft tissues that they encounter, it can measure the distance and generate an image. Ultrasounds can be 2-dimensional, they can be 3-dimensional, and when we say that they're 4-dimensional, we're talking about a 3-dimensional image in real time, meaning that there's no lag. Really good for internal details and structures, but largely based upon tissues.